I have a picture in there with us, my husband and I with him.
Well, welcome back to Black Renaissance. With us now is a quite remarkable woman of many trades. Jewel Taylor-Gibbs is a celebrated professor of social welfare at UC Berkeley, a noted clinical psychologist, and an author of 5 books. But she's here to talk about her latest book, Destiny's Child, Memoirs of a Preacher's Daughter. So welcome. So great to be with you here.
Thank you. It's good to be here.
Your 5th book. How long did it take to put this? It's a lofty ambition, putting a memoir together.
About 7 years,
Yeah.
yes. That was my project after I retired from UC Berkeley for 20 years. And I decided I needed something to really keep my mind active. And that book did take about 7 years with all the various versions of it and the photographs and researching the family history and going back 7 generations on my family tree, which was very much like Carl Lumley talked about.
Well, you know, every book for a author, I know, takes you on a journey of discoveries, this one especially. So what surprised you about the things you learned and found out and discovered about your family?
Well, that's a good question, because as children, my father had told us a little bit about his mother who died young, and that my grandmother was a free black. And we weren't too interested and didn't know exactly what that meant.
Yeah.
But as an adult, I decided I wanted to find out more about my grandmother. So I had several surprises, that she was from a family of free blacks in Virginia, and they had been free at least since 1745. I have records going back to 1745. I found out that my great-grandfather had fought in the Civil War, which again had been mentioned, but I hadn't really remembered. And 3 of his ancestors had fought in the Revolutionary War, all as free blacks. And so I'm very proud to be able to pass that information on to my grandchildren.
And was it tough doing the research? Was it tough to get all that information?
It was very difficult, but there are a lot of resources. And, you know, I used the famous Ancestry.com. And the Mormon Church has wonderful family libraries, which was an excellent resource. And then actually hired a professional genealogist to track down the people that I couldn't find in the census. And so it took a while, but I was able to reconstruct a family tree going back 7 generations.
Good Lord. I mean, a great thing to have now for your family in generations to come.
Yes.
You know, preachers, your father was a preacher. They're great at telling stories to the congregations and sharing so much with the congregations. But did your father share stories with you? I mean,
yes,
did he share much?
And he was also a great role model, because my father was very active in civil rights and politics.
Yeah.
So I grew up in a household of activists. My grandfather had been active in Washington, D.C. My father was in Connecticut, vice chair of the Connecticut Democratic Party, worked for all the presidents since Roosevelt. And so I was brought up in a household to be very active and very engaged in politics. And through my life, I've met such interesting people through my father and my relatives, including Thurgood Marshall, who came to my home when I was 11 and helped my father start a chapter of the NAACP in my small town of Ansonia, Connecticut.
Incredible.
And then later in college, I met Martin Luther King.
Well, I was going to say, literally, you know, you have a connection to preachers, but a love interest with Martin Luther King.
Well, I'm not sure I would call it love, but we were friendly, and our families sort of got us together. Both parents knew each other, and they sort of set us up. I was at Radcliffe, and he was at Boston University School of Theology. So we dated for several months, but mainly he took me to church, and after a while I said, you know, Martin, if we're going to continue to see each other, let's do something fun, like a movie or a party.
So did you never get to go to the movies with
Yes,
him?
I did. And then this relationship lasted about 3 months, and then I met another young man, and about the same time he met Coretta. So we continued our friendship. He married soon, about a year later, but we continued our friendship until he died.
I have to ask you about the movie Selma, an extraordinary piece of work. To watch that film, because you know and knew so many of those characters, how was that as a piece of filmmaking, for you to sit back and see part of your story and the story of those you know on screen?
It was very emotional, because my father knew many of the older ministers, and I knew some of the younger ministers. I knew Reverend Lowry, for example, was a role model for me too. And I knew Reverend C.T. Vivian, I knew Reverend Andrew Young. All of those people had been, I had met during my, adulthood, and my father had known some of the older ministers. So it was very emotional seeing that film and sort of reliving that history for me and for my husband.
Yeah, and of course, David Oyelowo should have been nominated, in my opinion, for an Oscar. He was so incredible as MLK. For you, as someone who did know Martin Luther King, how was his performance?
I thought he was quite good, and he reminded me a lot of the young Martin that I knew. And the woman reminded me a lot, his wife, of Coretta. She looked very much like Coretta when I knew them, and they were quite young when I met them. Both were graduate students.
Yeah.
So it brought a lot back to me, a lot of happy memories.
And you grew up where?
Connecticut.
But the Bay Area was home for more than 40 years.
For more than 45 years.
Yeah.
My husband was a professor at Stanford, and I was a professor at Berkeley. That's what brought us out here to Stanford.
And I know your husband, you've been together for
a very long time.
A very long time.
Yes.
What makes that marriage work?
I think that I always say you have to have several things in a marriage. You really have to be able to communicate, you have to be able to cooperate, and you have to be able to really find ways of letting each person be his or herself.
Yeah.
And to be able to manage conflict well. And I think we've been able to do those things.
Your book shares the history of your family, but part of your history and your story is what's happened in recent years. President Obama becoming president, and you were there for both inaugurations, correct?
Yes, well, the first one. My son was very active in the campaign.
Yeah.
And he enlisted us to help raise money for President Obama. So when they had the first inauguration, there were, in my family, 2 sons who worked for the campaign. My husband and I raised money, and we even took our little grandson, who was not quite 2, so we had a wonderful time.
Thank you for your time. Thank you for watching. For more on all our guests here today, please go to our website, cbssf.com.